This time, we're moving into the Gospel of Mark, which is actually the Gospel we're going to follow for the rest of the year, except for where John jumps in to fill in the gaps. But we're going to be looking at Mark in some depth. This is the year of Mark in the lectionary cycle, and you'll notice that there are some things about Mark that make it very obvious that it's not Matthew, not Luke, and certainly not the Gospel of John. One is the use of the word immediately. It was used twice in 6 verses there, immediately. Mark is a gospel of speed and pace. It is like that fast-paced adventure movie that we all want to, where it gets our hearts racing. Mark is a lot like that as a gospel. It's fast-paced, it's racy, it gets our hearts moving, and then suddenly comes to an end. Very quickly. We have to pay attention to the Gospel of Mark. If you blink, you're going to miss a really important line of dialogue. It's that movie where you can't go out to the washroom because you've had too much pop. Because when you come back, you notice that 3 people have gone from the plot line and they're in another country and something's changed. That's Mark. It's incredibly fast. It's also the gospel where we see Jesus in a light very different, I think, from John, who we were listening to just a few weeks ago. It's a gospel where Jesus is very interactive with people, and there's a lot of dialogue between him and the disciples. And in this piece here, we have that famous call of Andrew, James, and John, and Peter. Those 4 disciples whose names are etched into our hearts and minds because they seem to focus or appear everywhere in the stories. If something important is happening in the Gospels, we know one of those 4 boys is going to be there beside Jesus doing these things. Here, we notice that there is a turn in the story very quickly. Jesus has come out of the desert. He's been baptized by John. He's gone back into the desert to do his 40 days. And as he comes out of the desert, the first thing we learn is John is dead. And Jesus goes off to call his disciples. What I want to focus on is the piece where the call kind of begins, where Jesus calls them into this work, not because they have spent years preparing for it. Because really, is being a fisherman any way to prepare to be the disciple of the Son of God? No. These are ordinary people. You couldn't get much more ordinary in Galilee. These men who work with their hands every day, who probably, well, let's just say, they probably smell. Spend a lot of time around fish, you know? My neighbor, back in Scotland, my neighbor was a very keen fisherman. And where we lived on the greatest salmon river and the greatest trout river the UK has. We lived right between the Dee and the Don. So all you fishermen out there, those are Mecca, right? These are the Mecca. For every fisherman in the UK has to, at some point in his life, or her life, fish the Dee and the Don. You get salmon in one and trout in the other. And they are the best fish ever. Ever. My neighbor loved to fish. His wife hated the smell. We came to an arrangement very quickly after we moved into the house next door to them, when he discovered that I didn't mind the smell of fish as long as there was a salmon in my fridge afterwards. The smell of fish probably followed Peter, James, and John around all the time. They were ordinary working people. They hadn't gone to seminary for 4 years. They hadn't sat great priests at the temple to learn about the Jewish scriptures. They were ordinary folks. They worked hard for a living. They tried to raise families. Peter, we know, had a mother-in-law who was ill at one point, almost dying. They had lives like you. They had lives like me. They raised their children. They saw their parents die. They struggled with poverty. They struggled with hanging on sometimes. They were subsistence fishermen who, if the fish weren't running properly, weren't sure what they were going to eat that night. They were just like you. There's nothing special about them. They're not people of title or wealth or property or great learning. And yet the Son of God comes up to them and says, the time of God is upon us. The reign of God is near. Come and follow me. And because it's Mark, they simply get up and leave and drop everything around them. They don't ask if there's a special training course, if they have to go to Bible study. They don't ask if they have to give a certain tithe to the temple in order to participate in this. They don't ask if they have to go and ask permission from anybody to go do this, and have we signed the right forms and sent them to the head office, and they haven't asked any of that, and they certainly haven't asked council's permission. They have simply got up and got on with the work of being the followers of Jesus. As we contemplate our own discipleship, as we contemplate the discipleship of the community of faith that we are, there is a message for us here. It's a message about not waiting. You see, too often the church has gotten itself into a place where we have to wait until everything's right. We have to wait until the absolute right qualified person is in the position of authority or power. Or we have the absolute right person to do this piece of work. And because, I'm a little underqualified, it's probably not me. We too often look to the overqualified, or those who we think are qualified, to take us into position, to take us and lead us, when indeed what we're really supposed to be looking for is people who have deep spiritual lives. And I wonder if that's what Jesus noticed about these four fishermen. There's an old saying, an old army chaplain once said to me, there are no atheists in a foxhole. I wonder if there's no atheists in a fishing boat. When you're out there battling the elements and trying to haul in nets of fish and wondering if you're actually going to be able to feed your family, I wonder, when you live that kind of subsistence life, I wonder if there are no atheists in a fishing boat. And maybe that's what Jesus saw when he saw these men working away, carefully tending their nets, looking to the care of the things that they were to use for their work. I wonder if he saw in them that not so much that they were eminently qualified to be disciples, the most learned, the most clever, the most whatever, but rather what he saw was men who understood a spiritual life. A life that was deeply connected with God, maybe not even in a formal and religious way, but rather that they really understood a connection with God. And that God was ever present in the work that they did. Because they were so reliant on the Creator, God. The God who had created the earth and brought it forth from the dark void. They were relying on the Creator God who ensured that there were fish in the waters. I wonder if that was more what Jesus saw in them. Rather than 4 men who had done all of the studies that were required, who had learned their ancient Hebrew and their ancient Greek, and who knew exactly how to do congregational growth, because they had taken that course in seminary. And Jesus also says in this passage that the kingdom is now, is near, is at hand, is present. For he is there. He is present amongst them. He is ready. He is waiting on them. And all that they need to do is to engage in this kingdom is to follow him and be with him and learn and grow and share eventually that ministry. As I think about us, as we enter into this time of discernment, as we enter into this preparation for our annual congregational meeting, I wonder if there's really a message for us here. You see, too often we get wrapped up in making sure that the right person with the right qualifications is in the role of leaders. Or that we can only do this piece of ministry once we've got enough money and enough resources and enough help from outside in order to make it happen. Rather than to look at the ministry and say, is this a place where the kingdom is near? Is this a place where Christ is taking us? Is this a place where God is calling us? So often churches put in front of them all of these barriers to doing God's work because, well, if we do God's work, we have to leave our nets behind and we have to take a huge risk and kind of step off the precipice and go. And we need to let everything that we have known in the past behind. All of the security blankets we've built up around us to protect us are also holding us back. I'm always impressed and horrified and joyful and fearful when I read this passage. When I think of these 4 people who simply get up and walk off, who leave it all behind and recognize that they're being called into the kingdom. That they're being called into a relationship that will so change them and change their world. And I can't even imagine that they would have seen that as changing the whole world, but simply changing their little bit of the world. That they would be so willing to go out there and do that. And we as followers of the same Christ, we get so caught up in whether it's the right thing or the proper thing instead of the kingdom thing to do. And we get more wrapped up in whether we're qualified rather than called. That we're not willing to allow the Spirit, the creative force of God, to enter into our lives and help us be the ones prepared and ready to do the work. So as we go into February 4th, as we go into that Sunday to reflect as a whole community what it means, what we are called to do, and what it means for us to think that the kingdom of God is actually near because we have chosen to be people of God. We have chosen to be followers of Christ. I wonder what that will mean for us. I wonder what stirrings it will cause in your hearts Because something sure stirred those four guys. And we need to be stirred too. Don't go for the popcorn. Stay and watch the movie. It's fast moving. But Mark has so much to share with us about what it means to take that risk and step out and engage in the kingdom and follow Christ.